Hey everyone, it's Jen from Midnightsky Fibers, and I'm here today to talk to you about measuring the gauge for your hand-spun yarn. Knit a gauge swatch in hand-spun yarn without wasting yarn. So sometimes you want to knit a gauge swatch, but you don't want to go through the process of breaking the yarn, blocking it, weaving in ends, because hand-spun yarn is pretty precious. Most of the skeins, are only 50 to 100 yards of yarn, and you want to make sure that you don't run out for your project. So, before you start a project, you want to make sure that you knit up a gauge swatch for your hand-spun yarn. This is important not only so that you can get the gauge of your yarn, but also so you can get a feel for how the yarn is going to drape. Hand-spun yarn is has a very different hand compared to conventional yarns and even from other hand-spun yarns, because every hand-spun yarn is going to be different. It might be really smooth, it might have a really crisp hand, it might have really nice textural advantage of the thick and thin yarn. It's all going to vary. So you want to make sure that you know what the finished fabric is going to look like, since that's going to affect if you want a little bit of a tighter gauge or a little bit of a looser gauge for how much the hand-spun yarn is going to show up. Let's talk about how to knit a gauge swatch without wasting yarn. So you always want to knit a gauge swatch so that it's at least 4 by 4 inches. That's about 10 by 10 centimeters. And you want to measure it in several places over several inches. If you just measure just 1 inch, you risk being off by a half or a quarter of a stitch, which can add up to inches around for projects like sweaters or blankets. Can even add up to being an inch or more off on simple, smaller projects like socks or a hat, which can make them far too large or far too small. So when we knit a gauge swatch and we're trying not to waste yarn, you don't want to break the yarn after you knit the gauge swatch. You want to keep the yarn attached, block the swatch with the yarn ball still attached to it, just don't get the yarn ball wet. And then after you're done measuring the swatch, pull the swatch out and cast on to start your project. If you know that you're going to have enough yarn or you have multiple balls of yarn, you don't need to unravel the gauge swatch. You can go ahead and break the yarn and block the gauge swatch as you would normally, but you want to try and break the yarn in a way that's easy to splice the yarn back together if it turns out that you need that yarn later. Otherwise, just set that ball of yarn with the gauge swatch on it aside and use that one last if you need to. So, when gauge doesn't matter. Sometimes the gauge doesn't matter for projects. This is especially true when you're knitting simple garter stitch scarves, drop-down scarves, top-down hats, blankets knit from the inside out that you can choose the finished size, and for projects where the size isn't important, where you don't risk having a project being too big, too long, and so on. In these cases, you're going to just simply choose knitting needles that produce a pleasing fabric. You can test this by casting on 8 to 12 stitches and knitting a couple inches in the pattern that you plan on using. Often people will use something like anywhere from a 10.5 to a 17-inch needle to knit a bulky hand-spun yarn into a scarf. So it's going to knit up very quickly with very little effort and time, and it helps stretch small amounts of hand-spun yarn. This is especially true for drop stitch scarves. You can see one of my other videos for how to knit a drop stitch scarf, which goes really fast on large needles and only takes anywhere from 50 to 100 yards of yarn. For these projects, I don't usually take the time to measure my gauge. I simply start knitting a small swatch and I see how I like the fabric. So how to fix your gauge if you have too many stitches for every inch in your gauge swatch. If you have too many stitches for every inch in your gauge swatch, it means you need to use a larger knitting needle. A larger knitting needle means that you'll get fewer stitches per every inch. So if you have too many stitches on your size 5 needle, you need to go up to a size 6, do another gauge swatch, see if it still works. If you have way too many stitches, you'll often have to go up 2 knitting needle sizes when you have too few stitches in your gauge swatch. If you don't have enough stitches in your gauge swatch, it means you need to switch to smaller needles, which will give you more stitches for every inch. So for example, I knit very, very loosely. For most people, size 3 knitting needles or gauge using size 3 needles, I have to go down to a size 1 or even a 0. I knit socks on size 0 to 000 knitting needles. Very, very small in order to get gauge. Generally, you want to start going up or down just one knitting needle size when you're doing a gauge swatch, unless you know that you're off by more than a couple of stitches per inch. So how to measure garter stitch row gauge for handspun yarn. To measure the garter stitch gauge, a lot of people think that it's really tricky because they have a hard time telling where the different bumps are. So the purl bumps that you get every other row can be really hard to spot if the fabric all blends together and you're not used to counting row gauge. You just want to make sure that you're counting the same side of the garter stitch bumps. A little trick to help you do this, if you're having a really hard time telling, is knit one of the rows in a different color of yarn. The bumps on the one side will show up more easily. So for example, in this sample here, you can see where I've numbered the different stitches for, and including a half stitch in a yarn that's a different color from the yarn below it in the pattern. So you can easily count the different bumps where it goes across, and it's really easy to see where they are. So how to measure lace patterns for handspun yarn gauge. So lace patterns are almost always used for the measure of gauge if your project includes lace, unless you only have a tiny bit of lace on the edging, in which case the gauge probably isn't critical. But if you're using an all-over lace pattern, including several different all-over lace patterns, they will give you the gauge in one of the lace patterns, since lace is very, very different from stockinette stitch. So it's really important when you're measuring lace that you measure the gauge of the lace after blocking. And you want to make sure when you're blocking that you block it in the same way you will block your finished project. If you're planning on blocking your finished lace vest pattern or lace shawl pattern, and you're planning on using blocking wires and pins to block it, the life out of it, to make it as stretched out as possible, block your swatch in the same way. Otherwise, it's going to be a very different fabric when you finish. So you'll end up with a fabric that's far wider and longer, or both, when the lace is actually blocked. So all the handspun yarns and swatches in this tutorial are from Midnightsky Fibers, which you can find at midnightskyfibers.com.